You'll often see on the internet where people will talk about, and they'll call it two different things, the terrible threes or the miserable threes. And they're trying to alert people who are quitting smoking that there are certain time periods that really seem to be problems. And there's a conventional quitting wisdom out there that it seems to be tied to the threes, to the 3 day mark, to the 3 week mark, to the 3 month mark, and to the 3 year mark. Sounds catchy, but for practical purposes, two of those really have no merit. Two of them do, and I talk about extensively about the 3 day issue. And the 3 day issue is because that's how long it takes to detox nicotine from the system. In a 3 day period, nicotine is either excreted from the system or broken down into other components. Now, some of those other components, those byproducts, can cause certain problems for a few days, still into adjustment. But the real peak withdrawals that people may feel, and you'll notice whenever I talk about this in video format or whenever I write about it, they may encounter. I don't want it to be sounding like you will encounter. Some people quit and have no reaction whatsoever, and some people have intense reactions. Some people have no reaction whatsoever one time, and then they relapse, and the next time they have the intense reaction, and same issue. Some people have an intense reaction one time, they relapse, they're afraid of quitting again because they know what's going to happen, and it wasn't going to happen the next time. So the 3 day period, though, is how long nicotine can detox. The 3 week period really doesn't make a whole big difference one way or another. Do some people have a problem in 3 weeks? Yeah. Some people have a problem at 2 weeks. Some people have a problem at different time periods, having nothing to do with the time periods. It's what they're encountering possibly in those time periods. If in those time periods they all of a sudden have a death in the family, gosh, they're going to have a tough time. But that's a tough time because of a death in the family. It's not a tough time because it was a magical 3 day mark. Nobody should be working with the idea that there's some predestined time frames that are automatically bad because the second hand is clicked by on the clock just the right amount of time to cause a problem at that point in time. The 3 month mark, though, that one is different. 3 months is a season, and seasonal triggers can be real issues. You quit in the middle of summer, well, you learn how to lay on the beach, and you learn how to do, summertime routines that you just don't do other times a year. And so, sure, next time you face next summer, you've learned how to do those things, but that doesn't mean you know how to rake a leaf. That doesn't mean you know how to go to a football game. You've been to baseball games maybe in that time period. So sports change, activities change. Going back to school, if a person quits in the summer, when school starts in the fall, or when their kids' school starts in the fall, it changes the routines. And the last time you dealt with a routine like that, you were a smoker. So the 3 month period is real, although the 3 month period is also equivalent to a 6 month period and a 9 month period. They're seasonal alterations. The first time you hear a Christmas carol, if you quit smoking in February, we're talking about, 9 months later, 10 months later before you hear a Christmas carol on a radio. So the first time you hear it, it will trigger the response like, I smoke when I hear Christmas carols. Sometimes you won't even know what the trigger is. It'll be happening in the background. It'll trigger the response for you're supposed to be smoking right now, and you won't make the connection of why it's occurring. What's good, though, is even if you don't understand what the trigger was and why it triggered the response, by not taking a cigarette, you kind of break that trigger. And so there's going to be situations that happen that sometimes you'll identify instantly. Oh my gosh, because this is happening right now, I want a cigarette. And then the next time it happens, it won't be as bad. And 2 or 3 times later, you won't think about a cigarette. Sometimes you'll get the thoughts out of nowhere, but they're kind of not out of nowhere. There's something going on. It may be an aroma. It may be a song. It may be just a person you see. It may be a street sign. The last time you were always on that street, you were a smoker. And again, sometimes you won't understand what the mechanism is creating the thought, but by not taking a cigarette, you break the association with that specific trigger. So as far as the 3 month mark, it's real in the sense not because of the time period, but because of the seasonal alteration of that time period. If you live in an environment where nothing changes from throughout the year, that 3 month mark isn't as big of an issue. But most people don't live in an environment that's, flat 365 days a year exactly the same. There will be alterations with that. The 3 year mark, forget it. It's not an issue. By 3 years you've broken most of your major triggers. Now, can there be something that happened 3 years later that triggers? Of course there can. The first time you have, not the first time, because let's understand, if it's the first time that you do something, like if you have your first grandchild, you haven't had a prior grandchild before that was tied into smoking. But let's say it's your third grandchild or your fourth grandchild, and every other time you had a cigarette during, this particular event. Well, yeah, that will trigger the response. So there will be things that happen over time, but they're not tied to time. They're tied to the events that happen at certain, the periods in your life. They're not tied to, again, a secondhand ticking. They're tied to just life happening around you. So don't be concerned really with the 3 year issue. The 3 week issue, same thing. There's still new things happening in a 3 week time period, but those were also happening in 2 weeks and 4 weeks and 5 weeks. That's just, it's no magical time period there. The 3 day period, that's the physical withdrawal peaking. Yes, that's real. And the 3 month is seasonal, but the rest of it, don't worry about. And also, again, this is kind of tied into people reading on boards. You'll see somebody come in and say, oh, they had a bad day, on 10 days. They had a bad day. And then another person will come in and say, oh, yeah, they heard everybody has a bad time at 10 days. It's not true. Did they have a bad time at 10 days? Maybe. Is the person who wrote the first thing having a bad time at 10 days? Of course they are. They just wrote they had a bad time at 10 days. I take them at their word. But that doesn't mean there's something magical about the 10-day mark. That could have been filled in for any X number of days. There are going to be a few people who have similar experiences, yes, but that's not the norm. And I don't want people sitting around on day 7 dreading 3 days from now it's going to be bad because look what I read about this 10-day mark. And again, this could have been said about a 9-day mark. It could have been said about a 15-day mark. Don't work with the idea there's a predestined time period that something's going to go wrong. It's just not the way it happens. It's just things will occur because, again, situational cues will happen, events in life will happen, but they're not tied, again, to a specific time frame. They're just tied to life. So, all right, that's it for this one. To get through what people would call the terrible 3s or miserable 3s, is the same way of getting through any time period. It's by, during the event that's triggering a response, not giving into it, and then sticking to your personal commitment to never take another puff.